Welcome to part 2 of Reclaiming Our African Heritage. We're attorneys Andre and Daphne Wooten from Honolulu. Let's go exploring an ancient African city along the Nile River. The city of Waset became capital of ancient Kemet, Egypt around 2060 BC, when the Intep and Mentuhotep families of Waset established control over all of the country of the Two Lands after the First Intermediate Period. Across the river from the ancient city of Waset lie the valleys of the kings and queens where the pharaohs and queens are buried. Recently, in May 1995, it was announced that an enormous tomb, estimated as the burial place of 50 of the sons of Ramses II of the 19th dynasty, had been uncovered under the parking lot at the Valleys of the Kings. The ancient felucca sailboats still ply the Nile today, just as they did 10,000 years ago. The Luxor Temple still stands, though it was built by Amenophis III around 1460 BC. The Nile River allows for irrigation to create some beautiful gardens. This one is in back of the Winter Palace Hotel. This is the front of the Winter Palace Hotel, where we stayed in Luxor, also called Thebes by the Greeks, and previously Waset, which was the capital of Kemet from the 11th dynasty until 330 BC, when Alexander the Greek Macedonian conquered the country. Carved upon these walls of the Luxor Temple is the history of the people of the Nile and the people of the world that they touched. This temple, on the banks of the Nile, lies 500 miles south of the Mediterranean Sea. These columns, representing tied papyrus reeds, were built over 3,400 years ago. The tied papyrus symbolizes the taming and civilization of the Nile River. The papyrus is the reed from which paper was invented by the ancient Kemites. The word Kemite itself means black people in the ancient African Kemetic language. The obelisk is the traditional historical monument of the Kemites. Obviously, they knew how to build to last in stone, for these monuments are still standing. This obelisk tells the history and legends of Pharaoh Ramses II, a king of Kemet during the 19th dynasty, around 1290 BC. The mate to this obelisk now stands in Paris at the Place de Concorde, meaning place of the conquest. This row of ancient human-headed sphinxes used to connect the Luxor Temple with the larger Grand Temple of Amun-Ra along an avenue spanning 1.5 kilometers. It was said that each of the faces represents the face of an ancient pharaoh. When Herodotus visited Egypt, he was presented with a list of over 600 pharaohs' names by the priest Manetho in 400 BC. These ancient statues of Ramses II grace the entrance to the Luxor Temple, the southern temple of ancient Waset. This city was so magnificent that it had 3 different names during 3 different millenniums, the original African name being Waset, the city of 1,000 gates. Later, after 330 BC, the city was called Thebes by the Greeks. After the Arabs conquered the country in 641 AD, 1,000 years later, they began to call the city Luxor, meaning city of the palaces. This is a classic statue of Queen Nefertari, the paramount wife of Ramses II. He built a magnificent temple to her as befitting a Nubian princess at the Kush-Kemite border at Abu Simbel. These carvings represent Ramses II bearing offerings to his god Amun-Ra, and also illustrate the history of his accomplishments during his reign of 63 years. Illustrated very prominently on the walls of the temple is his war with the Hittites in the north, during which he was victorious. This is not just a magnificent stone monument, but each and nearly every foot of this magnificent temple is carved with inscriptions, histories, legends, philosophies, and genealogies. Only those who can interpret the Melanesia, hieroglyphics, know exactly what is symbolized here. The ancient Kemetic writing symbols held meanings on several different levels, both literal, conceptual, historical, and philosophical. Numerous statues of various kings, Ramses II of the 19th dynasty, King Tutankhamun, Kings Amenophis I, II, III of the 18th dynasty, and others line these walls. Some of the temple was damaged by earthquakes. Other damage was caused by Christian, Muslim, and Assyrian vandalism. But remarkably, even after the earthquakes, this much of the almost 4 millennia-old temple still stands. This is supposedly Ramses II, although Ramses II had a habit of erasing the original name of the owner of a statue and carving his own name. Our Arab guide is directing us now to a carving of Amen-Min. Amen-Min is the paramount god Amun-Ra in his fertility aspect. Amun-Min was the captain of the Nubian guards, the controller of the sacred myrrh trade from south along the Nile, which was essential to the embalming process. This is appropriate as this temple stands directly across the river from the burial grounds of the kings and queens of Egypt. This carving shows the god Horus, son of Osiris and Isis, giving the breath of life to Pharaoh Amenophis III. The accomplishments of Amenophis III, as well as Ramses and Tutankhamun, are carved here. This temple shows its African origins from further south along the Nile, and is also proof that it was the home of the classic Kemetic educational system as well. Scholar priests lived and worked here for over 1,000 years. It was a truly awesome feeling for this American African to stand within these walls. I, for one, in U.S. colleges was not made aware of any of these histories, any of these legends. In the near future, African American scholars must concentrate their efforts on translating the Melanesia hieroglyphics carved within these temples. There, the true understanding of African history will be illustrated. Many of the missing heads of these statues are found in the New York Metropolitan Museum, the British Museum, the Louvre Museum, and other quote-unquote Great Western museums, such as that in Berlin. The ruined statues of the pharaohs of Egypt are present all around this temple. This is a close-up of King Tutankhamun and his wife Amunraten, the legendary King Tut. King Thutmoses III also spent his energy expanding the Temple of Luxor. At the entrance to the temple are the 3 sanctuaries for Osiris, Isis, and Horus. Here we see a bird in the pattern now repeated in mudcloth fabric. Are parts of the older temple, which was ruined either from plunder or earthquake in past ages. The axis of the temple gives a clear view from the entrance all the way to the inner sanctuary, which is in the rear. These people are passing through the Roman porticos. Each wall of the temple is carved in reliefs which were painted in vivid technicolor in ancient days. Sometimes we can still see remnants of the ancient paint colors. The legends, philosophies, sciences, and histories of the African people of the Nile are carved right here. Here is one of our ever-present, ubiquitous smiling guides, showing us a small alabaster sphinx of Amenophis II. This carving on the wall is of Thutmoses III, the original builder of the temple. Note his African features. The sunsets across the river from the Temple of Luxor are very magnificent. Note the rays of light and power emanating from across the river. We are now in a horse-drawn carriage taking a little tour of the ancient city of WaSetThebesLuxor, Thebes, along the banks of the Nile River. This is a city so magnificent that it had 3 different names and 3 different millenniums. We are now passing the front of the Winter Palace Hotel, where we stayed during our visit there. One of these balconies was our room with a magnificent view of the Nile. We are now entering into the ancient marketplace where the local people buy their products in modern-day Luxor. Here we will get some sights and scenes of present-day Luxor. It is somewhat like going back in time at least several hundred, if not 1,000 years. We will try to let some of the natural sound come through here so you can get a feel for the people in their native garb and surroundings. Here is a man making shoes. I'm sorry the horse carriage is a little shaky over the cobblestones, but I hope you get a flavor of being among the local people and have an opportunity to see exactly who the local people are in this city 500 miles south of the Mediterranean Sea up the Nile River. We are about 300 miles south of Cairo here. And this is the entrance to the Grand Temple of Amun-Ra. These are the ruins of the oldest temple and the oldest university on earth. It is now called the Karnak Temple by the present Arab rulers. This temple was rebuilt in 2000 BC by Pharaoh Senwosret I of the 11th dynasty upon the ruins of a yet older temple. The front pylon facade was actually built by the 30th dynasty of the Greek-Egyptian Ptolemies. The average Egyptian temple has 3 pylons. This temple is an exception in that it has 10 in a row. Here we can see a row of sphinxes lining the entrance. Underneath the chin of these rams, almost like a beard, is actually a statue of a pharaoh. The pharaoh is being protected by the symbol of the god Amun-Ra, who is symbolized by the ram. Indeed, this temple was in its heyday during the age of Aries. The Kemites invented astrology. Here, this guide is explaining that this is the largest colonnaded temple on the face of the earth, spanning 65 acres. This is not one temple, but several temples. The temple of Mut, the wife of Amun-Ra, was destroyed by earthquake, or Assyrian or Arab plunderers 1,000 years ago. Nevertheless, the statues of many pharaohs still line the avenues of this ancient temple, and the columns are carved with the histories of the pharaohs who built a particular edition. Many of the 600 pharaohs built additions over several thousand years, which is why the temple is so enormous and magnificent. We are now looking at columns which were built by the Pharaoh Taharka of the 25th dynasty, who is mentioned prominently in the Bible as the defender of Judea in 750 BC. Here again we see the sphinxes lining the sanctuaries of the Holy Triad for Osiris, Isis, and their son Horus. One can actually look out through the entrance of the temple across the Nile River to the Valley of the Kings. This temple is oriented east and west, so that from the entrance you can see all the way through the 10 pylons to the sanctuary of the Holy of Holies. Here again, we see another statue of a pharaoh with the nose chiseled off. This temple is one of the chief reasons why the ancient city of Waset was called the City of 1,000 Gates. The temple has many, many passages. And this is a statue of the 27th dynasty Pharaoh Ptahmejis, who had Libyan African heritage and was pharaoh during the twilight period of history of Waset around 600 BC. And here we have an exquisite representation of his wife, who was the chief priestess of Amun-Ra at the time. Bring it up. Note the feet of this colossal statue with the missing body. Likely the body of that statue was found in one of the great museums of Western civilization. If you look closely, you can see the walls of the pylons built by Ramses II. The walls are carved with an exquisite detail of the histories and legends of the king that built them. If you look at the tops of the pylons underneath the roof, you can still see remnants of the ancient paint. The temple was carved in vivid technicolor. And here is our man, Amen-Min, the Ethiopian king and brother of Amun-Ra, in the great hypostyle hall built by Seti I, Ramses II's father. See the paint underneath the roof. This is the statue of another king next to a headless one. I was quite surprised in visiting the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Some of the plaques next to the busts of the kings there actually stated that the body of this statue still stands in this temple, the Grand Temple of Amun-Ra. The temple was known as the Hermothis by the Greeks when they renamed this temple after Hermes, their god of wisdom. Hermes was the Greek predecessor and disciple of the god Thoth, the Kemetic god of knowledge, and the first writer of books. This was the province of Thoth, for this was the central administrative seat and library for the priests who administered the Egyptian educational system for thousands of years. This is a stela of Thutmoses I, which tells his history and his legend dating back to 15,000 BC. The mate to this obelisk now stands in Central Park, New York City, and we described it in part 1 of our video series, Reclaiming Our African Heritage, Busting the Cleopatra's Needle Thutmoses Conspiracy. If you look up, you can still see the color of the paint after all these centuries. The columns are enormous, standing 72 feet. There are over 200 said columns in the central core of the hypostyle hall of the Grand Temple. The hypostyle hall was begun by Seti I of the 19th dynasty and finished by his son Ramses II.
The obelisk pierced the sky, saying African history cannot be denied. Here we have the view of the obelisks in the Temple of Karnak. Here's a close-up of the columns. Notice the hieroglyphics or the Melanesia, words of the gods, pictures of the gods. Here's the upper crown of Egypt with the lower crown of Egypt. As we go upwards towards the columns here in Karnak's temple, we can see that still color remains despite the floods and the desert sands that have covered this vast, wonderful temple. Look at the black sun. Here we have a close-up, and we can see Amun-Ra holding the Ankh with the sun inside of the cartouche. We are now taking a panoramic view of the Temple of Karnak. As you can see, the obelisk piercing the sky. In the olden Kemetan days, obelisks were covered with gold and silver on the tips. Looking around, you can see the vastness of this grand temple. Beautiful architecture. In fact, the Washington Monument in D.C. is based and copied of the obelisk of the Temple of Karnak in Africa.
On the southern side of the Amun Temple is the ruined Temple of Mut, the wife of Amun-Ra, the hero of the Greeks. It is impressive to be within the confines of the temple, for the scale at which the temple was constructed leaves one with a sense of planning and awe. Temples for the ancient gods, Khnum, Ptah, and all the others once stood here also. Different subjects such as medicine, law, or astronomy were taught in each different temple. The pharaohs who made the additions to the temple are pictured all around the different parts. A pharaoh holding the hair of captured war prisoners is a recurring theme. This is Ramses II and the battle with the Hittites in the north. The feat of ruined colossal statues gives quite a hint as to the enormity of the reality of this statue. In these places, the individual history of the kings and their people is carved, and thus the story of their times is preserved. The sun is beginning to set over to the west. This headdress is of the 25th dynasty Pharaoh Pianki of Ethiopia. This ruined statue is said to be of Hatshepsut of the 18th dynasty, the renowned queen of Egypt who ruled and was sometimes attired as a man, accepting the male attributes of kingship. Here, the pharaoh is again holding the hair of Assyrian war captains. Even with the ravages of ages, the magnificence of the temple still imposes awe upon a visitor. This 65-acre temple was supported by 500,000 acres of farmland throughout Egypt and supported 80,000 priests, professors, students, and acolytes who studied here in ancient days. Looking across the field 100 yards, one sees the ruins of chambers of the Grand University. One can then get some idea of the life of the intellectual and religious temple which existed here 3,000 or 4,000 years ago and lasted for thousands of years. Contrast all of this with the false teachings of Toynbee and Hegel that Africans built nothing and contributed nothing to the growth of civilization. Here we see a reflection of the gate of the Temple of Taharka in the sacred pool contained within the compound of the Grand Temple. Every morning, the priests would come down to the sacred pool and bathe themselves to purify themselves for their meditations and work of the day. Looking around this place, one begins to get a feeling of the energy and planning which went into the construction of this magnificent temple. The truth is, in fact, stranger than fiction. African science, practiced here along the Nile, is part of the bedrock of civilization. The sacred pool complex is certainly reminiscent of the Washington Monument Complex in Washington, D.C., created 5,000 years after this temple was constructed. The truth will set you free from racist miseducation. Formalized instruction was given in at least 40 major subjects: mathematics, astronomy, astrology, law, architecture, medicine, botany, and other sciences of the mind that one can only speculate about at this time. This temple abounds with the ruined faces of unknown kings. The chisel marks there somehow don't look accidental when one considers the relative smoothness of some of the rest of the statue and the mutilation of this face. Well, one just wonders who this was a statue of originally. Other gates in the distance give some idea of the ancient extent of this complex. The Egyptian mystery system was a regular course of study which took fully 40 years to complete. The Egyptian culture based itself to a large extent upon the observation of the natural world. That is why their language contained so many African animals and star constellations. It wasn't that they worshipped the animals, but that the animals symbolized ancient natural concepts and philosophies. At the rear, behind the Holy of Holies, stands the festival temple of Ramses II across the courtyard. These blocks contain the carved pillars of ancient temples, plundered and destroyed long ago. The statue of King Tut. Most of the broken stone columns on the ground are carved walls of ancient temples, and perhaps the ceiling, which was plundered by later barbarians. Across the aisle, one can see King Tut's wife, Amaratan, done in the style of the late 18th dynasty. Corridor of pylons to the temple entrance. Here we see that some of the paint is still left, and it leaves no doubt as to the physical description of the builder of this core part of the temple, Thutmoses III. Parts of this temple were also built by Thutmoses I, his grandfather, Amenophis III, his grandson, Senwosret I of the 11th dynasty, Mentuhotep of the 10th dynasty, also built important additions to the early part of the temple. Here we are looking at the festival temple of Ramses II, which stands across a courtyard in back of the Holy of Holies. And here we can see up this corridor, up through the 10 pylons to the entrance of the temple. Each pharaoh showed his devotion to his gods by making stone construction to show the permanence of their position and passage upon the face of the planet in honor of the gods who supported them. The sunset gives a very beautiful backdrop. Modern cranes are now used to reconstruct what the ancients did with methods we are not now fully cognizant of. For these cranes were used to replace stones that the ancients erected 5,000 years ago before these types of cranes were used. City of 1,000 Gates. We are now on the grounds of the Luxor Museum. Let's go inside for a brief tour. This plaque indicates that this is a statue of the ancient god Amun-Ra of Karnak with features of Tut in common. Amun-Ra was renamed Zeus by the Greeks. This is a statue of King Amenophis III, taken from his temple on the west bank of the river. This is a fresco taken from the tomb of Amenophis III. And this is said to be a statue of Sesostris III. This is a very fine statue of Amenophis III. The plaque indicates that this sphinx was a base with a face of Tutankhamun. This scribe is wearing the official gold of honor, meaning exceptional loyalty to the king. And this is a fresco of Amun-Min, the fertility aspect of Amun-Ra. Amun-Ra here is holding in protective embrace Amenophis Amenhotep III. And this is Amenophis III, taken from a huge temple wall on the west bank. This black granite statue is of Hathor, who was called Aphrodite by the Greeks. There are exquisite depictions around the sides in each direction. Sobek, god of medicine and symbolized by the crocodile, is on the top of the statue. Isis and Nephthys. Exquisite workmanship dating back to the 18th dynasty, 1500 to 1600 BC. This is a statue of Mentuhotep of the 10th dynasty, posed as Osiris. Ancient Egyptian artwork of a king. And another. And another. A terracotta. These boats date back over 7,000 years. A terracotta picture of Amenophis IV, who changed his name to Akhenaten and brought about a religious revolution and upheaval of the country which still reverberates throughout the world with his adoption of monotheism some 1,300 years before the birth of Christ. Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti giving thanks to Aten, symbolized by giving the key of life to his son. And this scroll is from the Book of Coming Forth by Day and by Night, renamed the Book of the Dead by Egyptologists. Osiris, being worshipped by a subject, is in this fresco. And this is an exquisite granite statue of a scribe, Amenophis I. And this is a statue of Akhenaten Amenophis IV. This is a mummy of a king of the 18th or 19th dynasties. Note the hairstyle. The false beard symbolizes wisdom and wealth. These fresco pieces were taken from the walls of a famous temple across the river in the Valley of the Kings. And this is a bust of Amun-Ra. And this is some of the gold that made Kemet and Nubia famous. Another mummy from the Valley of the Kings and Nobles. Spells and legends carved upon the sarcophagus are for having a good afterlife. These exquisite miniatures, carved from wood and gilded, are from the tomb of Tutankhamun. The workmanship is magnificent, especially when one considers that these statues are over 3,400 years old, and they accurately and realistically depict the people who lived and ruled at that time, 1420 BC. It is said that the black granite with which this statue is made only comes from Nubia. This is said to be a statue of Hatshepsut's lover Senmut and their daughter. And this statue is of Senwosret I, the famous Sesostris of the Greeks who rebuilt the Grand Temple of Amun-Ra in 2000 BC upon the ruins of an older temple and extended the empire of Kemet across the Mediterranean Sea to the Peloponnese and Greece, Crete, and also into Libya and Nubia. Amun-Ra here is holding Ramses II in a posture of protection. Contrast this Greek arch from a later period in the history of Waset, after the conquest by Alexander, with the previous examples of Kemetic architecture we have seen. Down this corridor are statues of the Kemetic gods Amun-Ra, Isis, Nephthys, and Horus, which were buried for their protection during the time of Akhenaten, the monotheist. They were just found in a secret vault beneath the Grand Temple in 1992. Unfortunately, the museum was closing and we were not allowed to photograph this exhibit in much more detail, which gives us an excellent reason to return. So we jumped on a boat and went across the river to tour the valleys of the kings and queens. At this time, we had signed on for a 5-day cruise south up the Nile River. The crew broke into language groups for tours with other boat passengers. I was surprised, and some of the other Americans in our English-speaking group were shocked by the frequency with which the local people greeted me with the phrase, "Welcome home, Nubian brother." Then frequently I would be offered a special deal on a souvenir artifact. At least they told me it was a special deal. These are the famous Colossae of Memnon, referring to the Egyptian prince Agamemnon of the Iliad, written by Homer, who led 10,000 troops in the defense of Troy in the Trojan War. Actually, these statues are of Amenophis III and used to grace the entrance of his temple, which stood here. In the distance is the Temple of Hatshepsut, which we are going to visit now.
Here we are on a bus ride, headed out to see the Temple of Hatshepsut. Notice the artisans' multicolored homes. Very artistic. Many of these people have lived in the Valley of the Kings for years and centuries. They are the tomb diggers, as well as the artisans. Generations of people live here, next to the Valley of the Kings and Queens. Now, the Valley of the Kings has temples built out of the cliffs that overlook the Nile. It's very hot here, and as you notice, there's very little vegetation. Here we are, getting ready to go up to the Temple of Hatshepsut, and we have some artisans selling their wares. Here's the Temple of Hatshepsut. It was built by her vizier, Semut. Another look at the cliffs overlooking the Temple of Hatshepsut in the Valley of the Kings. The Valley of the Kings is also known as the Place of Truth. The temple, built for Hatshepsut, glistens, shining below the desert cliffs on sacred land. Her body has not been found. Here, Pharaoh Hatshepsut's spirit lives on, resurrected, like Osiris. We're getting ready to go up and get a closer look of this grand temple. Before we enter the temple, we're taking one last view of the Valley of the Kings, the cliffs overlooking the Nile. And here we are entering Hatshepsut's temple. Hatshepsut ruled Egypt in the 18th dynasty. She ruled and dressed like a man. She would wear a false beard depicting strength and power. Yet she was all woman. Let us go up and take a look at the many statues. Here we have Hathor, depicted as a cow. Hathor is the goddess of love, beauty, and art. Here is another pillar of Hathor. It's an exquisite statue. Pharaoh Hatshepsut worshipped Hathor. There was much art and dancing and beauty during her reign. This is a close-up of Pharaoh Hatshepsut. Here, our guide talks about Hatshepsut's successor, Thutmoses III, her half-brother. As you notice, he defaced many of her pictures. And he actually destroyed her temple, which is now being rebuilt. Here we have an exquisite picture of the expedition Hatshepsut led to Punt. Punt is now called Somalia. The expeditions would result in bringing back frankincense, animals, food, plant, foliage. Here's another picture of Hatshepsut. Now we're going to do one last look at this grand temple for Pharaoh Hatshepsut. Praises to Hatshepsut, the grand visionary. Her statues, temples, and obelisks still stand, paying tribute to Hathor, Isis, Osiris, respecting creativity, art, and architecture. Hatshepsut still lives in this beautiful temple overlooking the Nile in the place of truth. Here is a depiction of Anubis, the god protecting the dead. He protects Hatshepsut's spirit.
This is the tomb of Taharka, Deir el Medina, west bank of WaSetThebesLuxor. Note the Horus falcon. And this is a close-up of the interior of Queen Hatshepsut's tomb, showing her, or Thutmoses III, her half-brother and successor. This is a beautiful mural from the Temple of Semgen on the west bank. And this outstanding mural of the green regenerator god Osiris is also in the tomb of Taharka. Semgen and his wife in their tomb before the four sons of Horus on the west bank of WaSetThebesLuxor. Semgen's soul riding on the back of Hathor, accompanied by Herakti, the sun and moon. Semgen and his wife making prayers to the Egyptian Kemetic pantheon. Semgen addressing Horus and his brothers in his tomb in the High Noble Cemetery on the west bank. Semgen and his wife receiving the fruit of life from the tree of life in their tomb in the Valley of the Nobles. Semgen painted in his sarcophagus with the bud of new life sprouting from the bottom. He is flanked by the falcons bearing the headpieces of Isis and Nephthys, the eternal mourners.
I have linen, the glue, put alabaster 5 days in the sun. After the mikahor, this one first one pieces. After 2 pieces again the linen. Why the linen, the glue, and mikahor, no black. After and the polish by fire. After fire, polish sandstone inside and outside. After sandstone, 10 minutes in the oven, 150 degrees in the polish by wax, the natural colorful stone alabaster. 4 kind alabaster. 3 handmade, 1 machine made. White, brown, green handmade, yellow alabaster machine made. Gentlemen, give him a cap, statue, head, horns, anything here handmade alabaster. Okay, you understand me? Have a look, final stay. Welcome.
Leaving the colorful alabaster carver's shop and the ancient tomb maker's village, we next head to the Valley of the Kings. Here, we wait in the parking lot by the concession building for the mini train to take us the last 1/2 mile to the major tomb entrances, which are open. However, only a year after we left this parking lot, it was announced that the entrance to a huge tomb possibly holding the mummies of 50 of the sons of Ramses II was located at the end of this very parking lot. Dismounting the mini train, we have our choice of fantastic ancient royal tombs to explore. Ramses II and VI, Seti I, Amenophis II, Thutmoses III, and of course, the tomb of King Tut, the smallest in the valley. Photography is strictly limited in the tombs as flashbulbs can harm the ancient paint, but we managed to take these actual interior pictures to show you inside.
Here we have Nefertari, Valley of the Queens, holding Horus. Here she is giving offerings to the gods. This again is a depiction of Osiris, the god of the afterlife, found in the tombs. Here's Nefertari being led by Hathor, the goddess of love and beauty. Again, an exquisite depiction of Osiris in the tombs. This tomb, found in the Valley of the Queens, again at Nefertari, with Horus. This is a depiction of Thoth, the bird-like god. Here's another depiction in the Valley of the Queens, the tomb of Amenhotep. Here we see people in all various walks of life. Here they are paying homage to the trees. This is found in the nobles' tombs. The tomb of the nobles are located right next to the Valley of the Queens and Kings. This is the tomb of Mena. Once again, you see people working. Here we have an individual seated next to a tree, breathing the lotus flower, the flower of life. Here's Attorney Andre Wooten standing in front of King Tut's tomb, which is located in the Valley of the Kings. This is a depiction of Nut. She's the goddess of the universe. She swallows the sun and gives birth to the moon. Notice the stars. This is King Tut's tomb. We were fortunate to go down inside and take a look. However, it was quite crowded and cramped. Here we have the tomb of Horemheb. Notice that Horus is there as well as Hathor. Another depiction of Nut swallowing the sun as she gives birth to the moon and the stars. Here are the spirit boats that are located in Ramses VI tombs. The spirit boats will take people up into the afterlife. Here we have the tomb of Horemheb again, Horemheb giving offerings to the goddess. Here is Nephthys on the coffin. She is the goddess of the afterlife, with her sister Isis protects the body. And here is Anubis. He is the jackal protector of the bodies.
As you can see, all of our trip was not spent observing only tombs and museums. On New Year's Eve 1994, we did endeavor to mix and mingle with the local people and other travelers. A lively floor show put a smile on everyone's face as the local entertainers did their thing. We made friends with a nice couple who were visiting from Japan. After Kemet was conquered, Alexander allowed Aristotle to move the great ancient library from this place to his new capital of Alexandria. We only discovered this outdoor museum on the north side of the Grand Temple as we were about to leave. This original carved granite fresco still shows the 18th dynasty celebrating the Opet festival. Anubis, the sentinel of the underworld and afterlife, seems to stand guard and bid us farewell as we leave the awesome African city of Waset, a city so magnificent it had at least 3 different names and 3 different millenniums.
Here we are, taking a cruise down the Nile on our boat, the Nile Presidente. We are leaving Luxor and headed towards Aswan. As we go down the Nile, we will see many different types of houses, agriculture, people. Very interesting life on the banks of the Nile. Here we have men sitting about contemplating the world. You can see some buildings in the background, and notice the date palm trees providing shade. You see people who use the Nile for irrigation purposes, and people also use the Nile to wash clothes, to bathe, and to fish. Of course, the Nile is used extensively for transportation. Here's a pier with some young men sitting down nearby, watching the Nile Presidente cruise by. The Nile is known as the key of life, and its symbol is the Ankh. They called it the key of life because through the Nile, people received nourishment, food, water. They were able to clean themselves. It's very important in all of Africa. It's another boat, method of transportation. Donkey grazing on the grass with a structure which probably holds either dates or grains. Notice the colorful yellow house. The sign. Here we're taking a look at the width of the Nile with the Nile Presidente flag blowing in the wind. Here's some young men doing a modern Egyptian dance for us. They're right on time. They don't do the break dancing, they'll do the Nile dancing. Here is our Nubian brother, attorney Andre Wooten, taking in the Nile cruise on the Nile Presidente. Little smoke as we go down the Nile. We look at the riverbanks, see the various life's aspects. On the Nile, the fishermen pound the water to get the fish. The fish with the pounding water go into the nets. Here's soccer on the banks of the Nile. It's a very popular sport in all of Africa. It's called football. Here's another view of a house. Notice the flat rooftops. On the rooftops, people will gather, drink their coffee and their tea, and discuss daily events. Here's another soccer game played by young village men. And here are the people on the rooftop, greeting us, watching us as we watch them. It's another view of a household on the banks of the Nile. A little bit of graffiti there, not too much. Here is the African woman. As she washed her clothes in the Nile, put it on a basket on top of her head, walking up the banks of the Nile to her house. There are no steps. Watch her as she gracefully climbs the cliffs. Here's the rest of the household sitting about. And we're coming up to the city of Edfu. As we say goodbye to you for part 2, we hope you will join us part 3, reclaiming our African heritage.
Hello, I'm attorney Andre Wooten.
And I'm attorney Daphne Barbie Wooten.
What you see is what you get, and what you don't see, you may never get. However, you have just seen the oldest university and temple in the world, the Grand Temple of Amun-Ra, where Socrates, Pythagoras, Aristotle, Thales, Diodorus, Herodotus, and many of the other ancient Greek philosophers went to school after taking the circumcision initiation and learned from the ancient African Kemetic priests. The full course of study took 42 years, and the remnants of the ancient mystery system of the Kemites lives today in the form of the Masonic orders and the Rosicrucian teachings.
The Pythagoras theory was not discovered by Pythagoras. Pythagoras studied and learned that theory from Africans over at the Temple of Amun-Ra. It's also important to note that the Washington Monument in D.C. is built and copied after the obelisk and the sacred pool at the Grand Temple of Amun-Ra, as you have seen for yourself, your own eyes.
African American history is vitally important precisely because the Africans were singled out for slavery upon American soil. Hollywood did not stop its slander of Africans and African Americans with The Birth of a Nation almost 100 years ago. Last year, in 1994, they brought you Stargate, a movie telling you that the pyramids were built by malevolent aliens from outer space.
Rather than African people.
Never once has Hollywood done one movie about any of the 600 African pharaohs. The truth, however, will set you free.
I think it's also important to note that you had women who were very powerful, such as the Pharaoh Hatshepsut, a woman who ruled Egypt for 20 years, as you've seen her temple in the Valley of the Kings. So thank you for being with us, and we have King Kamehameha behind us.
King Kamehameha was the first king of the Hawaiian nation. He conquered the rest of the islands in 1795. The building behind us used to be the palace of the Hawaiian monarchy. Now it houses the Hawaii State Supreme Court. The kahuna, Mama Loa, once told us that originally the Hawaiians come from Egypt.
Thank you, and stay tuned to part 3, where we travel and visit more temples going towards Abu Simbel and Aswan.
Mahalo. Aloha. Amen.